Hi, good morning, everyone. Everyone know what this is? This is an amazing device. It does so many things that it actually seems kind of short-sighted to simply call it a phone. I know that's how it originated, but gosh, they do so many things nowadays. And I would say that probably making phone calls is probably the fourth or fifth most used function now that I use this thing for today. I think that probably the number one thing, or the most important thing that I use it for, is the calendar function. Okay? The calendar function is so important to me because I use it to schedule absolutely everything in my work and my personal life. So I came to the realization that no matter how many things I'm trying to juggle in my life at any given time, that at any given moment, I can only be in one place. And so I rely on the calendar to tell me where that place is. If I put something in there, I'm going to be there. And if I don't, I certainly will not. Now, the other nice thing about the calendar is that with just a single glance, I can see visually, like right in front of me, how busy I am. If I have a lot of colorful blocks showing up in my calendar, then I know that's going to be a busy week. And whenever that happens, whenever I see a lot of colorful blocks in my calendar, I try to correct it by scheduling in rest or free time. I'll literally put in rest into a calendar spot. And that prevents me from filling those empty time slots with another meeting or another appointment that I might otherwise be tempted to do. So what my calendar and my phone are teaching me is how to balance work and rest. Now, as we talk about work and rest, I'm not saying that one is good and the other should be avoided, and I'm not saying that one is inherently more important than the other, because ultimately I think it's about balance. And the wisdom in balancing work and rest lies in knowing when to do each, and that there is a place for each. Now, one important thing to note, I believe that our culture does not value work and rest equally. And I imagine it's quite likely that most of us here hold views that reflect the cultural attitude that sees work as better and more valuable than rest. This cultural attitude is deep in our roots. Our Puritan ancestors had a saying that idle hands are the devil's playground. And while Puritans are not still around today, their legacy in this country lives on. Even the very word business is a barely disguised version of busyness. And our system that prizes work and productivity would have us believe that our value as people comes from our ability to do, to make, and to produce. Well, is our society right? Is work more important than rest? Well, I think I gave away the answer earlier when I said I thought they were equal. But I truly don't believe that work is more important than rest. And I believe that our first principle that affirms and promotes the inherent worth and dignity of every person leads me to conclude that our humanity is not measured by what we can do or how much we're able to produce. I believe that affirming our first principle means affirming a balance of meaningful work and meaningful rest. And this is a balance that helps us recognize the inherent worth and dignity that each of us already has. And so, when it comes to work and rest, and not believing one to be worthier than the other, but recognizing that the value of rest is more likely to be underappreciated, let me make a case for why rest is a good thing. Consider this parable of the woodcutters. Once upon a time, as parables often start, there were two woodcutters who both claimed to be the fastest woodcutter in the land. So they agreed to both work from sunup to sundown and see who could cut down more trees by the end of the day. Woodcutter number one began swinging his axe as soon as the sun broke over the horizon. Listening, he could hear his opponent chopping away in the distance. But every hour or so, woodcutter number one noticed the sound of his rival's chopping, and it would stop. Aha, he's taking breaks, thought woodcutter number one. I'll continue cutting wood while he rests to ensure I have the lead. He delighted in this and swung harder and faster every time he heard his opponent stop, so as to take full advantage of his rival's pauses. Woodcutter number one even worked right through lunch. Well, when the sun finally dropped below the horizon, both woodcutters set down their axes, and the number of fallen trees was counted. Now, much to the surprise of woodcutter number one, woodcutter number two was declared the winner. "Well, that's not possible," exclaimed woodcutter number one. "I heard him take breaks while I never rested all day. How could he possibly have cut down more trees?" "Every time you heard a pause in my cutting, I was resting and renewing myself," said the second woodcutter. "And every time I paused to rest, I sharpened my axe." I like this parable for its message of lifting up rest and for raising the importance of caring for ourselves and for the instruments that allow us to do meaningful work in the world. However, I still find the parable problematic for a couple of reasons. First, that it reinforces the cultural values of competition and productivity. And second, it misses the mark on why rest is important. We don't rest purely so we can return to working. Like eating or sleeping or even listening to music, we can take pleasure in it for its own sake. Eating may serve a function, as in refueling our bodies, but when I went for ice cream last week, it wasn't for nourishment. I did it because I like ice cream for its own sake. Show of hands. How many of you hit the snooze button on your alarm this morning? Only a few. Wow. Well, I sure did. And I didn't hit the snooze button because I had calculated that exactly 10 more minutes of sleep would be just what I needed to reach an optimal state of restedness. I did it because those extra 10 minutes in my bed felt really good. I took pleasure in sleeping for its own sake. And so it can be with the rest that we engage in during our waking hours, too. Work doesn't have to be the default setting of our existence. It can be one setting among many. We shouldn't rest just so we can work harder. We should rest because it's a valid part of our human experience. That, and we might just enjoy it. So, how do we counter this message of work being the default setting? how do we live a life that truly balances work and rest? I've got some suggestions. First, by engaging in spiritual practices. Spiritual practices have a way of cultivating mindfulness and attitudes of appreciation, wonder, and gratitude. We can live into a life that balances work and rest by sipping, by savoring, and by sauntering. By taking things in slowly, and by allowing time to appreciate your experiences and to be mindful of your sensations and your surroundings. And by being patient. These practices take time to cultivate, and that time has to be intentionally set aside from the busyness of our minds and aside from the busy actions that are aimed at being productive. Andrew C. Kennedy writes, "There once was a rabbi whose custom it was to pray for an hour each morning. The rabbi was asked, 'But what about when you're busy? Do you cut back to a half hour or 15 minutes?' 'Oh no,' the rabbi replied. 'When I'm really busy, then I pray for 2 hours.'" If we are to truly embrace a balance between work and rest, then, like the rabbi, we must be intentional about making rest a priority in our lives. But why should I? Some of you might be thinking. Well, let's look at what happens when we rest. In addition to being more balanced humans, because of our experiencing a wider range of humanity, we rest so we can grow. Physically, muscles grow when they're resting, not when they're working out. And so I wonder if, similarly, we do the work of our lives and then take time to rest and reflect, if this is how we grow our hearts and our minds and our souls. What else happens when we rest? Well, I know from personal experience that my drive to work is a completely different experience when I leave early than it is when I'm running late. When I'm in a state of busyness and rushing, I find it very stress-inducing. And when I'm running late, everything looks like an obstacle, and it feels like the whole world is conspiring against me. But when I embrace a slower pace by setting aside time, I feel much better. I don't mind if people pass me or if they go slower than I like. By living into a life that values balance over busyness, I feel more human. Now here's the thing about feeling more human. If I can better recognize my own humanity when I embrace the value of rest, imagine how that might also help me see the humanity of others. And now imagine a community that values a balance of work and rest, and how they might treat one another if we were all just a little more in touch with our own humanity and the humanity of others. And now imagine a community that works together and rests together. A community that recognizes that relationship building happens in times of both work and rest, that it happens while marching together for justice, as well as when we break bread together at a potluck or share coffee in the social hour. This is what it means to belong to a beloved community. We work together, and then we rest together in the love that we have created. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in this love. We rest in this love. Blessed be.
Dan can sing, you guys. Beautiful. You may have heard the phrase Protestant work ethic before. The idea has to do with the Reformation, that world-changing moment when there was a formal break from the Catholic Church, within the Catholic Church, from it, and Protestant Christianity was launched. We'll talk more about the Reformation on its 500th anniversary next month. Yeah. Yeah, you have your calendars marked for this, right? 500th anniversary of the Reformation. It's an important piece of our own UU history, although we don't consider ourselves a Christian church because we embrace much more theological diversity than that category implies. We are still a Protestant church, so I'll say more about that later. But what does Protestant work ethic mean? And where did that even come from? The Catholicism that dominated Europe before the Reformation considered good works, including hard work, an important part of faith. It was seen as a fitting response to, or maybe even a manifestation of, the gift of faith that people had received from God. Being hardworking was a sign of being a faithful and good and grateful Christian. Then Protestantism came along with some challenging new ideas. Now, it was spurred largely by outrage at priests who were selling indulgences. The Catholic priests would encourage people to pay money to the church as a way of making reparations with God for sins they had committed. In other words, you could mess up and then you could just buy yourself an early release from hell or purgatory. Well, this did not sit well with folks who did not have a lot of money, and it seemed to condone harsher punishments for poor people than rich ones. And why should the rich be let off easy? Didn't Jesus say it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven? Yes, he did. No one reads that part. Yes, he did. Protestantism arose in outrage to those indulgences that were being sold, in protest. Protestantism. That's where we get the word. I wish I could say that the poor and the rich now face the same consequences for their actions, but one look at who's incarcerated in this country is all the evidence you need to see that we still privilege the wealthy over others. Protestantism also challenged the role of priests. People no longer had to pay priests indulgences or even go to them at all in order to make amends for sin. People could now have a direct relationship with God, one-on-one. And Protestantism also shifted the thinking about work, especially the strain of Protestantism known as Calvinism. As soon as the Protestant church was launched, naturally there were different stripes within it. Calvinism is the one that those Puritans Dan mentioned would take across the Atlantic, colonize the area we now call New England, and, as he suggested, they would go on to have a lasting impact on our country's dominant culture. According to Calvinism, God has already predestined a certain number of people to go to heaven. It's already set. And you don't know if you're one of them, unless you live a bad life, in which case everybody can tell you're not. So, Calvinists threw themselves into hard work, frugality, and self-restraint, trying to at least look like candidates for salvation, trying to keep that option on the table for themselves. Working very hard took on an especially pious, I think almost competitively pious, glow. The Puritans, those Calvinists, are the direct religious ancestors of Unitarian Universalists. If you're hearing that for the first time, you might be going, what? Right? But that's right, the Puritans were our people. It's a long story how we got from there to here, but their impact on the formation of this country does explain a lot about why Americans tend to work more than people in other developed nations, and why many of us feel guilty or uncomfortable about taking a full share of time off and, resting or even recreating. Well, working a lot was fine when people were plowing and growing and tending little markets. But with industrialization in the 1800s, we got big factories. And the long hours there weren't like long hours in other places. They tended to be indoors, away from family, repetitive. Big companies sprang up and profited off of their poorly paid workers. Enter labor unions. People organized in unions for decent wages, humane hours, and something called the weekend. I don't really understand this weekend thing. People are like, TGIF, thank God it's Friday. And I'm like, Sunday is coming. What are they talking about? Dan, do you know? No? It's thanks to labor unions that we have standards for many jobs, like the notion at least, of a 40-hour work week, and the idea of weekends and Labor Day, a holiday to recognize the role of labor in continually creating this country. And we are continually creating it. No feeling, no policy, no shameful situation is final. We're going to keep on moving forward. Of course, even before we had the idea of weekends, there was the Sabbath. And work isn't always just work. There's a parable about two Buddhist monks who both liked to smoke cigarettes. A lot, like all the time. And concerned about whether it was permissible to smoke during their long periods of prayer, they each agreed to consult with their superiors. One was told in no uncertain terms that smoking was prohibited. The other received praise and a pat on the back. Confused, the disappointed monk asked his friend exactly what he had said to the abbot, and his friend replied, "I asked him whether it's okay to pray while smoking." That's a naughty little parable, isn't it? That's not like Dan's parables. Don't take it literally. The point is, we can enjoy life while working if we adopt the right mindset about what we're doing when, right? These days, and even if we do, we still need a balance of rest. These days, there's a movement afoot to ensure that all workers have the right to earn a living wage, so that people can get by on something like the 40-hour work week and not have to hold down 2 or 3 jobs. I know some of us in this room work jobs that wouldn't pay rent if you only worked full-time, I've worked those jobs too. I cleaned houses and I worked as a caregiver for 10 years while my husband and I gradually got ourselves through college. The new movement for worker justice also calls for paid sick leave because nobody should have to choose between taking a sick day and paying a heat bill. This is the next evolution of the American labor movement, which intentionally left many people out in the past, especially based on race. In exactly 1 month, on October 3rd, Albuquerque residents will have the opportunity to vote on something called the Healthy Workforce Ordinance, which would mandate that employers in Albuquerque provide paid sick leave to employees. Anybody heard of this ordinance? Did you know we had a vote coming up? Okay, good for you. In an op-ed in the Albuquerque Journal, Adrienne Barboa tells the story of her grown son who had to have emergency surgery, and then he went straight back to work the next day, all swollen and on medication, instead of resting like his doctor instructed, because if he missed a day of work, he wouldn't be able to pay his bills. No paid sick leave. That kind of thing is especially hard on parents, too, who, in addition to compromising their own health, might have to send their kids to school sick rather than staying home with them in order to be able to put food on the table. Adrienne is the director of Strong Families New Mexico, an advocacy group that works for the well-being of diverse families. Families are the very fabric of our country. Some in the business community are complaining about how much it will cost them to give everybody sick leave. Some have said they're afraid if they have to fire somebody who took sick leave, it'll look like they're punishing them for it and they'll be sued and it will destroy Albuquerque's economy. That was written in an article. I guess they don't keep good records and don't want to. Here at First Unitarian, we already offer paid sick leave to employees who work 20 hours or more, and we support flexible scheduling for employees who work fewer hours so that they can make up their missed time as needed. It means sometimes we have to live with getting a little bit less done around here so that we can take care of people. We also do have to maintain good records, but that's just doing what's right. It's wrong to treat people like they're a means to your end. We have to respect each other's humanity and worth and dignity. That's one of the reasons First Unitarian has recently been awarded New Mexico's family-friendly business designation. Now you can read the proposed ordinance and the debate and compare it with what we do here at the church if you'd like and decide what you think for yourself. But I do hope that you'll go vote on October 3rd. We need to vote every single time there's an election about anything. That's the way forward. Right. Yeah, good. Now, to our friends who are listening at the branch congregations in Socorro and Edgewood, I'm talking to you, branch congregations. I checked, and you don't have a municipal election coming up, but you will, and you'll need to vote too, every time. There's one more thing I want to say about the dominant American culture's take on work, which is that it's very individualistic. Even though workers are part of continuously creating our country, that's not how we usually talk about it, is it? If we did, we'd have the good of the whole in mind, starting with families. Instead, the dominant culture is all about personal achievement, the myth of the independent, self-made person, and especially about trying to accumulate wealth and stuff. Those values are what we see reflected in our policies that prioritize convenience or extra-wide profit margins over the well-being of workers and families. It runs like a zero-sum game. If one person gives something up, like a business giving employees sick leave, they feel that they've lost something. In her book, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, Juana Bordas contrasts this tendency with subtler cultures within the U.S., with the non-dominant but still very much present cultures, African American, Native American, and Latin American cultures, where relationships and the good of the whole, not individual gain, are most valued. Isn't that what we need right now? To tend relationships and to care for the good of the whole. I'll talk more about that next Sunday in a sermon called Hope. Until then, may your work and rest be for wholeness. Let's rise in body or in spirit for our closing.